That old woman again. I told you not to let this old hag in here. You're stinking up this entire elegant place. That was the welcome my daughter-in-law gave me in the middle of the crowded dining room of the luxurious restaurant that my son manages. She pointed her finger directly at my face, screaming with absolute contempt under the astonished gaze of the important VIP client who was accompanying me. She thought that with her expensive silk dress and her title as manager, she had the right to trample all over my dignity. She gloated, truly believing that I would walk away ashamed, like a beggar. But she was completely wrong. If she wanted to play the boss, I would show her who really had the power of life and death over this place. My name is Helen. If I were to go back just 10 minutes before that moment, everything was still full of hope. It was a radiant, bright noon in Chicago. I had chosen my most elegant moss green dress, smoothed out every crease in the fabric, and took a deep breath to compose myself with the grace of a woman who had fought in the brutal business world for 40 years. By my side was City Councilman Reynolds. A very important client. He was looking for the perfect venue to celebrate his spoiled daughter's wedding, and I knew that the Heritage restaurant was exactly what he needed. This wasn't just a lunch, it was a lifeline. The revenues of the Heritage, my life's work, had been plummeting under the management of my son and daughter-in-law. I desperately needed this contract to set things right. I smiled, presenting the place with pride. Right this way, Councilman Reynolds. At the Heritage, we don't just sell food. We sell the very soul of classic American comfort cuisine. An employee pulled open the heavy oak door. A blast of cold air from the air conditioning hit my face, bringing with it an overpowering scent of designer perfume that completely masked the mouth-watering aroma of the slow-smoked brisket simmering in the kitchen. I frowned slightly. Right in the center of the main dining room, at the best VIP table overlooking the indoor fountain, sat my daughter-in-law, Chloe. With her legs crossed, she was laughing and chatting animatedly with a group of fashionably dressed friends. The table was littered with expensive bottles of wine, even though it was barely noon. Upon seeing me walk in, the smile on Chloe's lips vanished. In its place appeared an expression of absolute horror mixed with disgust, as if she had just seen something filthy crawl out of a sewer. She looked at my somewhat classic dress, then at her curious friends, as if terrified that the mere presence of her elderly mother-in-law would embarrass her. Without giving me or Councilman Reynolds a second to react, Chloe jumped up, pushing her chair back and sending a harsh, shrill screech echoing across the marble floor. She screamed, her high-pitched voice shattering the atmosphere. That old woman again. The entire restaurant was stunned into silence, but she didn't stop. With her perfectly manicured fingernails pointing straight at my face, she continued yelling, "That old hag again! I told you not to let this old woman in here. You're stinking up this entire elegant place." Time seemed to freeze. The clinking of crystal glasses ceased. The jazz trio playing in the corner abruptly stopped. The sound of the piano died out. A dead, suffocating silence blanketed the Heritage. Every single pair of eyes turned toward the entrance where I stood, completely paralyzed. I felt my blood run cold, not out of fear, but from the sheer humiliation that invaded every cell in my body. I frantically searched the room for Eric. My son was standing by the mahogany bar, just a few feet away. Eric had heard everything, without a shadow of a doubt. I looked at him with pleading eyes, waiting for him to step forward, to say absolutely anything to defend his mother, or at the very least, to save face in front of an important guest. But no. Eric just lowered his head, nervously playing with the hem of his vest, pretending to examine a bottle of wine, not daring to look at me even once. His cowardice was like a knife twisting in my heart, far more painful than Chloe's insults. Councilman Reynolds, standing beside me, cleared his throat. He looked at the furious Chloe, then at Eric hiding by the bar, and finally rested his compassionate gaze on me. He shook his head in disapproval. "No, I am so sorry, Helen. I don't think the environment here is suitable for my daughter's wedding. We will speak later." With that, he turned on his heel and walked straight out the door without looking back. The biggest contract of the year had vanished into thin air. I was left entirely alone in the middle of the dining room that I myself had built, brick by brick. My self-esteem lay trampled beneath my daughter-in-law's stiletto heels and my son's pathetic silence. I wanted to scream. I wanted to lunge at her and teach her some basic manners. But I didn't. I am Helen. I am not some fishmonger at a street market who gets into screaming matches in public. I took a deep breath, trying to suppress the violent trembling shaking my body, keeping my back as straight as humanly possible. I turned around and walked out, leaving behind the mocking giggles that were beginning to erupt from Chloe's circle of friends. I collapsed into the driver's seat of my old Ford sedan, slamming the door shut, isolating myself from the noisy, cruel world outside. The engine sputtered to life with a heavy groan, sounding just as exhausted as my own breathing at that moment. I didn't turn on the radio. I needed silence to soothe the cracks breaking open in my chest. The car moved slowly, taking me away from the bustling downtown of the city and toward my old house in a quiet suburb. A red light on Lakeshore Drive brought me to a halt. In that moment of indefinite waiting, I let go of the steering wheel, rested my hands on my thighs, and stared at them in silence. These hands were not slender, soft, and perfectly painted like Chloe's. The skin on my hands was wrinkled, speckled with dark brown age spots like the shell of an old walnut. But what stood out the most were the faint, crisscrossing burn scars. Some had faded with time, others were still clearly marked. A cloud of memories suddenly surged into my mind, as spicy and vivid as if I had just taken the lid off a boiling pot of stew. 40 years ago, the Heritage wasn't the luxury restaurant with crystal chandeliers and white linen tablecloths that it is today. Back then, it was just a dilapidated food cart on a dusty street corner. I remember it like it was yesterday, the biting chill of the Chicago night winds at 3 in the morning. When the whole city was still fast asleep, I was already awake. Strapped tightly to my back in a worn-out baby carrier was little Eric. The steady warmth of his breathing against the back of my neck was the only source of heat keeping me warm in the freezing fog. The smell of burning charcoal, the aroma of dough being kneaded for homemade buttermilk biscuits, the aggressive sizzle of hot bacon grease in the cast-iron skillet for the breakfast hash. All those smells had seeped into my hair and my skin for decades. I remember the times when boiling oil would splatter directly onto my bare hands. It was a sharp, searing pain, but I didn't dare drop the skillet or scream, terrified of waking the sleeping child on my back. I could only bite my lip, letting the skin blister as I kept stirring the meat. Every single dollar earned in those days was soaked in sweat and blood. When my husband, Peter, suddenly passed away from an illness, the burden on my shoulders grew immensely heavier. I had to be both father and mother. I had to be tough enough to face down the aggressive suppliers at the wholesale meat market, yet incredibly tender when I got home to spoon-feed my son his dinner. Bite by bite, I built this empire out of absolutely nothing, with the sole hope that Eric would have a bright future, that he would never have to suffer through the soot and the smoke like his mother did. The car turned onto the familiar gravel driveway leading to my house. The house had been eerily silent ever since Eric got married. I had handed over the management of the restaurant to him as a wedding gift, wanting him to learn how to be the boss. But I kept the actual ownership and property deed in my name, a small precaution from a woman who has seen far too much in life. At the time, I couldn't possibly have imagined that this precaution would become my only lifeline today. I thought he would inherit this legacy with profound gratitude and appreciation, but I was wrong. Chloe came along, bringing her superficiality and toxic materialism with her. She didn't see the heritage as the fruit of our family's blood and sweat. She saw it as an endless gold mine to be exploited. She criticized my recipes as outdated and my older, loyal employees as too slow. But the most painful part wasn't my daughter-in-law's insolence. It was the change in my son. Chloe's late-night whispers had completely transformed Eric. The obedient little boy I once carried on my back had turned into a weak, unrecognizable stranger. I remember it clearly, the day Eric stood in front of me with evasive eyes, stammering out that he was moving. "Mom, I think we should move to a condo downtown." "Chloe. She needs her own space, and she really can't stand your bitterness." I stumbled into the dark living room, not even bothering to turn on the lights. The word bitterness still echoed relentlessly in my head. I was strict with the staff because I wanted the food to be perfect. I reminded Chloe to spend moderately because money wasn't easy to earn. Was that bitterness? Or had my excessive indulgence made it so my son could no longer distinguish between loving advice and a malicious critique? I groped my way through the darkness to the small memorial corner I kept in the room. The faint light from a street lamp filtering through the window illuminated the black and white photograph of Peter. In the picture, he was smiling a kind, confident smile. Beside him stood me, 30 years younger, full of life, my hands firmly intertwined with his. I raised my old calloused hand and tremblingly stroked my husband's face through the cold glass. "Peter," I whispered, my voice choking in my throat. "Do you see? Our legacy, my blood, and my tears, they are destroying it." I took a deep breath, aggressively wiping away a tear that threatened to fall. I looked straight into Peter's eyes in the photograph, as if searching for his approval. The weakness and the nostalgia gave way to an ironclad determination that was beginning to resurface, as scorching hot as the glowing embers in my old kitchen stove. "Peter, I'm so sorry I let things go this far," I said in a low but unwavering voice that echoed in the empty room. "But I promise you, I will not let anyone destroy what we built, not even our own son. I am going to take it all back." The tears of humiliation had completely dried up, making way for a very different emotion, one much colder and sharper: suspicion. I walked straight to my study. The room smelled of cedar wood and aged paper. It was the place that had been my sanctuary during the decades I ran the business. I approached the wall-mounted safe. I spun the dial. Click. The dry sound of the deadbolt sliding open echoed in the room. Inside lay a neat stack of dark yellow manila envelopes, covered by a thin layer of dust that betrayed my own negligence. They were the monthly financial reports that Carol, my veteran and fiercely loyal CPA, had been secretly sending me. Carol had hinted to me several times, "Helen, you really need to look at the books. There are numbers here that speak for themselves." But what had I done? I had laughed it off. I dismissed her concerns and shoved them into the safe. I trusted Eric blindly. I thought my son needed space to grow into a man, and that my intervention would only make him feel micromanaged. A stupidly blind trust. I carried the heavy stack of documents to the oak desk. I turned on the yellow desk lamp. I put on my reading glasses. I pulled out a red pen. In this exact moment, I was no longer a wounded mother. I was Helen, the woman who had clawed her way up in the business world for 40 years. I started flipping through every single report. The very first thing I saw was the accounts payable list. My breath caught in my throat. The Heritage, a restaurant famous in the city for its impeccable reputation of paying on time, hadn't paid its food suppliers in 3 solid months. 3 months, Mr. Harrison's Meatpacking, Mary's Farm Fresh Produce, even Peter's old favorite bakery supplier. My trembling fingers traced over the familiar names. These were partners who had worked with me since the days I pushed a cart down the freezing street. They extended credit to me based purely on the rock-solid reputation I had built with my honor. And now, my son was trampling all over that trust. Why were there debts? Where was the revenue going? I frantically flipped to the expenses section. The category labeled Marketing and Representation jumped out at me like a massive ink stain, a vertical, absurd, bright red upward curve. The spending in this single category last month was in the 6 figures. I gritted my teeth and pulled out the thick stack of attached invoices to examine them. There lay the raw, ugly truth, printed on fragile slips of paper. Invoice from May 12, 20 bottles of premium, vintage French wine. Insanely expensive bottles that the regular clientele of the Heritage rarely, if ever, ordered. Invoice from May 18, a special luxury seafood banquet. 20 pounds of imported blue lobster and beluga caviar. Invoice from May 25, hiring a live string quartet and importing fresh exotic floral arrangements for an internal tasting party. Internal. I looked at the bottom right corner of every single invoice. There, instead of Eric's messy but careful signature, was the flowery, bubbly handwriting, complete with a little drawn heart over the eye of my daughter-in-law, Chloe. It was all being written off as corporate representation expenses, but I knew perfectly well that not a single paying client had enjoyed these things. These were Chloe's decadent, lavish parties for her gang of vultures. They were eating and drinking on the dime of my sweat and tears, burning through the profits while the hard-working suppliers went unpaid. Rage exploded in my chest, burning as fiercely as if I had swallowed glowing charcoal, but I forced myself to remain calm. I needed to keep going. I flipped to the payroll section. The employee roster was long, but where were all the familiar names? Chef Mike, who had cooked the best beef stew in the state for 15 years, was gone. Reason: does not meet innovation expectations. Amanda, the cleaning lady, a hard-working single mother who always left the floors spotless, fired. Reason: slow work pace. Frank, the elderly security guard forced into early retirement. And who replaced them? A string of unfamiliar names. Kevin, Sophia, Bella, trendy-sounding names. Their salaries were double what the veteran employees had made. And in the reference section, the phrase "friend of manager Chloe" shamelessly repeated over and over again. I dropped the red pen onto the desk. The sharp clatter echoed in the silence. So that was it. She didn't just want to enjoy the luxury, she was entirely purging the heritage. She fired everyone who was loyal to me, everyone who knew the true history of the restaurant, just to plant her own people. She wanted to turn my legacy into her personal playground, a bottomless ATM for her frivolous entertainment. And Eric, my son. Where was he when his wife was signing these papers? What did he do when old Chef Mike packed up his knives and walked out the door? He stayed silent. A complicit, despicable silence. I looked around the study. The business awards, the framed newspaper clippings about the massive success of the heritage hanging on the walls, they all looked like a sick joke now. I thought I had given my son a throne from which to rule, but it turned out I had handed them a butcher knife to hack themselves to pieces. I didn't just lose my respect in the restaurant this morning. If this continued, in just 1 month, when the creditors came knocking, I would lose absolutely everything. My entire life's work would be reduced to these red debt figures. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to suppress the nausea rising in my stomach. The smell of old paper was now sickeningly bitter. I opened my eyes, staring intensely at Chloe's heart-shaped signature on the wine invoice. My gaze no longer held a mother's leniency. It had become freezing cold, calculating, and analytical, just like the days when I had to fight tooth and nail for a spot at the wholesale market. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the ice I felt in my very soul upon seeing those numbers speak for themselves. Have you ever felt like a lifetime of pure kindness, sweat, and tears was being ruthlessly thrown out the window by your own loved ones? The feeling of discovering that you are nothing but an ATM in the eyes of your children is truly devastating. If anyone out there understands this pain, please share your story in the comments below, just so I know I am not alone. Night had fully fallen. The chirping of crickets in the garden blended with the wind whistling through the window cracks, composing a gloomy suburban Chicago symphony. I sat completely still in the leather chair of my study, facing the pile of financial documents stained with fraudulent numbers. The lights in the room were dim. Only the yellowish glow of the desk lamp illuminated my aging, exhausted face. Suddenly, the phone rang. The shrill sound violently shattered the dead of night, making me jump. My heart skipped a beat. I looked at the glowing screen. The words "Eric, son" blinked repeatedly, like a final ember of hope in a pile of gray ashes. My trembling hand reached out. For a brief second, the soft heart of a mother resurfaced. Maybe he was calling to apologize. Maybe, after getting home, he had reconsidered his wife's reckless and disrespectful behavior. Maybe he was just calling to ask if his mother had gotten home safely, or if she was hurting from the afternoon's insults. Whatever the case, Eric was still the boy I had once carried on my back, the boy I had spoon-fed chicken noodle soup when he was sick. I took a deep breath, desperately trying to steady my voice, which was on the verge of breaking. "Son." I swiped my finger to answer, bringing the phone to my ear. "Hello, Eric-san." I didn't even get to finish the sentence when my son's voice blasted through the receiver. No greeting, no concern. Just a rushed, freezing reproach so alien that I briefly thought I had answered the wrong number. "Mom! Mom, do you have any idea what kind of mess you caused today?" I was stunned, a massive lump forming in my throat. What mess did I cause? Eric let out a heavy sigh, his tone dripping with irritation and sheer exhaustion, as if I were a cumbersome chore he had to deal with before going to sleep. "You completely embarrassed Chloe. She's crying in our bedroom right now." You know, Chloe is very sensitive. She needs to keep up appearances with her high society friends, people who can actually elevate the status of our restaurant. I couldn't believe my ears. Embarrassed? Who was the one embarrassed this afternoon? Who was the one thrown out like a stray dog from her own business by her daughter-in-law? "Eric, what on earth are you saying? Your wife screamed at me in front of my VIP client. She threw me out." "That's because you showed up at the exact wrong time," my son interrupted, raising his voice and drowning out my words. "You know she is the face of the restaurant now, but your presence, showing up, looking so outdated. You put her in a really awkward situation with her friends. Look, next time you want to come by, just give us a heads up first so we can set up a table for you in a hidden corner. It's just better for everyone, you understand? A table in a hidden corner. That sentence felt like a bucket of boiling water thrown directly into my face. I felt my cheeks burn, and then go completely numb. My son, the son for whom I had sacrificed my entire youth, now wanted to hide me away in some dark corner as if I were a piece of shameful, broken furniture. He wanted me, the true legal owner, to sneak around like a criminal inside my own restaurant. The profound pain instantly mutated into an uncontrollable, blinding fury. I slammed my hand down on the stack of papers on the desk, the pages crinkling beneath my calloused fingers. I couldn't take it anymore. My infinite patience had been utterly pulverized by his cowardice and staggering ingratitude. A hidden corner? My voice shook, not out of fear, but from an erupting volcano of rage. You want to hide me away so your wife can keep playing her little role as the elegant queen? Eric, open your damn eyes and look at what the so-called face of the restaurant is doing behind our backs. I quickly flipped through the documents, my eyes locking onto the glaring red numbers. My voice turned to pure steel. I have the financial reports right here in my hand. You haven't paid the suppliers in 3 months, Mr. Harrison, the butcher, called me begging for payment because his wife is in the hospital. Meanwhile, look at what your wife has been doing. Lobster and caviar parties for her girlfriends. Hundreds of bottles of expensive wine written off as representation expenses. What representation? Are her friends potential clients, or just a pack of freeloading parasites coming to gorge themselves? There was a few seconds of dead silence on the other end of the line. I genuinely thought this irrefutable proof would finally snap Eric out of it. I expected him to be shocked, to ask me frantically about the debts. But no. His exhausted sigh of annoyance sounded again, followed by a light, mocking chuckle. Here we go again. You're already starting to look for problems. Look for problems? I screamed, hot tears of sheer frustration springing to my eyes. I am talking about the survival of the heritage. She isn't acting like the face of the restaurant. She is deliberately sabotaging the business. She fired all the veteran staff, even Chef Mike and Amanda, just to replace them with her gang of useless friends. Do you realize we are on the absolute brink of bankruptcy? Enough, Mom! Eric yelled back, his voice thick with the exact same toxic bitterness Chloe always used. Stop making excuses. I know perfectly well what your real reason is. I stopped dead. What reason? You're just jealous of Chloe. I was struck completely mute. The phone nearly slipped from my hand. What? I whispered. What? You're jealous because she's young and beautiful, because she gets to enjoy the things you never had in your youth. You can't stand the fact that I love her and spoil her, so you go digging through the books, making up fake debts just to cause trouble and drive a wedge between us. You are incredibly selfish. You know that? The world around me completely collapsed. I sank back into my chair, feeling as though my chest had been violently hollowed out. There was no pain left, only a terrifying, gaping void. This accusation wasn't just ignorance. This was the ultimate proof that my son's soul had been completely brainwashed and manipulated. Faced with the raw, undeniable truth of the numbers, he actively chose to blindfold himself and plug his ears, using the twisted logic of a coward to attack me instead. The son named Eric, the man I hoped would take over the family, was dead. The person speaking to me on the phone was nothing more than a puppet, a spineless shadow merely repeating the poison his wife whispered into his ear. He didn't defend me, he didn't believe me, and worst of all, he twisted my boundless love and concern into the petty jealousy of a bitter old woman. Mom, you really, truly disappoint me, Eric added, firing one final shot in a sickeningly condescending tone. I stared into the dark corner of the room, where the photo of my smiling husband sat. I remembered the fierce promise I had made just hours earlier. I will not let anyone destroy what we built. Not even our own son. I didn't say a single word more. Any explanation at this point would be utterly useless to someone who had actively chosen to be blind. The sacred bond between mother and son, that rope I had clung to until my hands bled, had just been severed by my son's own words, cleanly and cruelly. Slowly, I raised my hand. My thumb pressed down hard on the red button on the screen. The call ended. After the call, the massive house plunged into a terrifying silence. a silence that brought no peace, but rather weighed like a heavy shroud over my soul. I could no longer sit still within the four suffocating walls of the study. I desperately needed air. I threw a shawl over my shoulders in a hurry and walked heavily out into the backyard. The Chicago night was late and bitter. The trickling sound of the water fountain in the middle of the garden was constant, like the whisper of ancient spirits. I stopped in front of the massive old oak tree where I had set up a small outdoor memorial for Peter. The pale moonlight reflected off his photograph, making my husband's face seem simultaneously incredibly close and impossibly distant. I stood there, staring deeply into the eyes of the man who had shared all the bitter flavors of life with me. "Peter," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "I was wrong, wasn't I?" I asked myself that question I don't know how many times that night. Did I love my son, or was I destroying him? For all these years, I had fiercely overprotected Eric. I was terrified of him suffering, terrified of him feeling the scorching heat of the kitchen stove, terrified of him having to bow his head to difficult customers like I had to do in the past. I had paved a beautiful road of roses for him to walk on, but I completely forgot that a tree that never endures the harsh sun, the biting wind, and the violent storms will never grow deep roots into the earth. I had turned my son into a fragile, weak vine that only knew how to cling to a rotting trunk. And now, encountering a venomous parasite like Chloe, not only was he incapable of defending himself, but he actively turned against the very roots that had nourished him. If I continued to indulge him, secretly paying off his mounting debts and retreating into the shadows just like he wanted, Eric would remain a pathetic parasite forever. And the legacy, the heritage, the business Peter and I had sacrificed our entire youth for, would be devoured by Chloe until nothing was left but a hollow, empty shell. A strong gust of wind blew, making the dry leaves crunch loudly under my feet. The freezing cold made me shudder, but it was that exact same chill that completely cleared my mind. I brought my hand to my face, firmly wiping away the stray tears rolling down my cheeks. The gesture was decisive and hard. There was no trace left of the weak, elderly mother who had just had her heart broken. I lifted my head and inhaled a massive breath of the crisp night air. The gentle, patient, and endlessly understanding mother of yesterday officially died with that phone call. Now, standing under the pale moonlight, there was only Helen, the woman of steel who had once made the toughest wholesale suppliers in the meat district tremble. My gaze sharpened, becoming as unnervingly calm as the surface of a lake right before a catastrophic storm. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I still knew by heart, even though I hadn't called it in over a year. The phone rang 3 times. On the other end of the line, it was picked up. A sleepy but highly cautious voice spoke. "Hello? Helen? What's going on at this hour?" It was Robert, the incredibly diligent, sharp-suited general manager who had worked side by side with me for over 20 years. A deeply honest, silver-haired man with immense self-respect. Chloe had aggressively forced him into early retirement just last year, simply because he dared to refuse to process one of her personal luxury shopping sprees as a business expense. At the time, Eric didn't stand up for him, and I, trying desperately to keep the peace in the family, remained silent and let him walk away. A wave of sharp regret washed over me, but I crushed it instantly. This was no time for sentimentality. "Robert," I said, my voice low, gravelly, and entirely unshaken. "I apologize for waking you at this hour, and I deeply apologize for the injustice you were forced to endure last year." There was a heavy silence on the other end, as if he were holding his breath. "I need you to come back, Robert. Immediately. Helen, but young Eric, and Miss Chloe." Robert's voice hesitated. "Forget about them," I cut him off, freezing and decisive. "The Heritage Restaurant is still completely under my name. I am the sole owner. I am the one with the power to decide. Tomorrow, we are taking everything back. I need you to assemble a professional private security team, men who take orders strictly from you. Contact my personal attorney right now. Tell him to draft the immediate termination papers and the asset seizure documents. Tomorrow morning at 8 sharp, we go to war." Robert's heavy sigh of immense relief was audible through the speaker, accompanied by an enthusiasm he could barely disguise. "Understood, ma'am. I have been waiting for this exact phone call for a very long time. I'll have all the paperwork and the personnel ready. Tomorrow at 8 o'clock sharp, I will be standing at the front door of the restaurant." "Good. Thank you, my old friend." A new, formidable alliance was forged in the dark, without fanfare, but carrying immense weight. I hung up the phone, staring out at the dark windows of the sleeping city. This decision would make my children fall incredibly hard. It might even make them hate me forever. But it was far better for them to cry bitter tears today than to watch them end up utterly ruined tomorrow. And you? If you were standing at this exact crossroads, what would you choose? Would you keep enduring the abuse in silence? Or would you accept playing the role of the cruel mother to teach them the hardest lesson of their lives? I deeply value and want to hear the advice of your valuable experience in the comments. Monday mornings in Chicago always begin with a chaotic symphony of blaring car horns, newsstands opening, and the relentless, rushed rhythm characteristic of a major metropolis. But for me, this morning was strangely peaceful. It was an eerie, unsettling silence like the dead calm of the ocean right before a tsunami hits. I didn't get up early to cook or water the plants like I did every other day. By 7 in the morning, I was already standing in front of the full-length mirror. The person reflecting back wasn't the tired, old Helen in a smoke-stained apron, but the fierce, unstoppable Helen from 20 years ago. I chose a perfectly tailored, sharp black suit. On my left lapel, I pinned a silver oak leaf brooch, a symbol of endurance and deep roots. I applied a dark, bold red lipstick, elegant enough, powerful enough, and thick enough to entirely conceal the paleness of a sleepless night. I walked out to the car. My personal driver was already waiting. To the Central Bank on LaSalle Street, I ordered briefly. The car glided smoothly, blending into the heavy morning traffic. I didn't look out at the urban scenery. In my head, at that very moment, there was nothing but numbers, legal clauses, and a wildly precise, military-grade plan. There was absolutely no room for sentimentality here. A mother's boundless love had to step aside for the iron discipline of a ruthless businesswoman. At 8:30 a.m., I was the very first client to walk into the VIP lounge of the bank. The air inside was crisp, smelling distinctly of fresh paper and money. The branch manager, Mr. Carter, rushed over to greet me the second he saw me. His smile held a hint of surprise, as it had been a long time since I had come in personally, having usually delegated everything to Eric. "Helen, what an honor. What brings you in so early today? Is young Eric doing well?" I didn't return his smile. I just gave a curt nod and cut straight to the chase. I sat down, placed my heavy leather handbag on the glass desk, and pulled out my ID documents and the official corporate seal. "Mr. Carter, I didn't come here to chat over coffee. I need to make some extremely urgent changes to the corporate accounts for the Heritage Restaurant." Mr. Carter paused for a second, instantly picking up on the lethal seriousness in my tone. He sat down across from me, nervously adjusting his silk tie. "Yes, ma'am. I'm listening." As the sole legal owner and primary financial guarantor, I said, pronouncing every single word as clearly and sharply as a glass cutter, "I demand the immediate freezing of all checking, payroll, and corporate accounts operating under Eric's authorization. Immediately." Mr. Carter's eyes widened like saucers. "Freeze them? But ma'am, the business. Eric won't be able to sign checks or process any payments." "That is exactly what I want." I cut him off. "Thank you. From this exact second forward, absolutely every transaction must bear my direct, personal signature or the signature of the new representative I will appoint shortly. No exceptions whatsoever." The manager's fingers began flying across his computer keyboard. The frantic clacking echoed loudly in the quiet office. I didn't give him a second to catch his breath. "Next," I continued, "cancel every single platinum corporate credit card I opened for Eric and his wife Chloe. Cancel them all." "All of them, ma'am? Even Miss Chloe's card?" "Every single one." I tapped my index finger hard against the glass desk. "Cut them off completely. I do not want to see one more red cent from my accounts going into their pockets. Do it right now." I watched Mr. Carter's computer monitor. When the word "deactivated" flashed in bright, glowing red next to the names of my son and daughter-in-law, I didn't feel a single shred of regret. A massive wave of relief washed over my body. I had just brutally severed the financial umbilical cord that fed their toxic dependency and boundless greed. It was exactly what had to be done. At 9:15 a.m., I walked out of the bank. The sun was starting to sting. I checked my watch. Everything was going perfectly according to schedule. Next stop, The law offices of Mitchell and Associates. Attorney Mitchell was an old, trusted friend who had handled my legal affairs since the very first day I opened the brick-and-mortar restaurant. His office was in a historic building, smelling strongly of thick law books and aged mahogany. As soon as he saw my face, he understood the sheer gravity of the meeting. He didn't bother with trivial small talk. He just pushed his glasses up his nose and listened. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Helen?" Mitchell asked, one last time, as the printer spit out the final draft of the termination papers. It will be a permanent stain on his professional record. I stared down at the crisp white paper with black ink sitting in front of me. The bolded title read, "Notice of Termination of Management Position." Right below it was Eric's full name, and the reason for termination spelled out in brutal, honest clarity: gross financial mismanagement resulting in severe corporate losses and severe breach of fiduciary duties. I picked up the heavy fountain pen. The metal barrel felt ice-cold in my grip. I remembered the cowardly, downcast gaze of my son from the afternoon before. I remembered his arrogant, dismissive voice on the phone last night. "You're just jealous of Chloe." "I am certain, Mitchell," I replied, without a single tremor in my voice. "He needs a brutal lesson, and my business needs to be saved." My pen glided smoothly across the paper. The signature was aggressive, powerful. Helen, this exact same signature that I once used to take out desperate bank loans to sign bulk contracts for sacks of flour and beef. I was now using it to strip away the illusory power I had mistakenly handed to my arrogant son. "And this," I said, sliding a second document toward him, "is the official appointment of Mr. Robert as interim general manager. Robert will have full executive authority to represent me in all restaurant affairs, effective 10 a.m. today." Mitchell stamped both documents with his heavy red notary seal. The loud thwack of the stamp echoed through the room like a judge's gavel coming down to deliver a final sentence. It was officially done. Legally speaking, Eric was now a complete stranger to the heritage. He had no power to sign, no power to give orders, and most importantly, absolutely no money. At 9:45 a.m., I stepped out of the law firm. The phone inside my purse remained dead silent. Perhaps back at the house, Eric and Chloe were still sleeping in late, or enjoying a lazy, lavish late breakfast, dreaming about their next insanely expensive party. They didn't have the slightest clue that the sky had completely collapsed on top of them, and that a hurricane had just wiped out the rotting foundation they were standing on. I watched the bustling crowds on the Chicago streets. I suddenly felt 10 years younger. The razor-sharp edge and cunning of a seasoned businesswoman had rushed back into my veins. I was no longer the sad, old mother waiting by the window for her son to come home for dinner. I was the one behind the wheel now. I picked up my phone to call Robert. "All the paperwork is finalized, my old friend. I've emailed you the scanned, legally binding copies. It's time to step into the light. Show them what real, ironclad management looks like." On the other end of the line, Robert's voice buzzed with fierce energy. "Understood, boss. The security team is locked and loaded. We are moving into the heritage now." I put my phone away, lifted my chin high, and walked toward my waiting car. The real game had just begun. A short while later, I was sitting at the heavy desk in my home office, the thick curtains drawn shut to block out the glaring morning sun. In front of me, there were no cups of warm tea or fashion magazines, only an iPad streaming the live, high-definition feed from the security camera system inside the heritage. The black coffee sitting on my desk had gone ice-cold, but I didn't even bother to take a sip. My entire, undivided attention was glued to that glowing screen. I felt a massive rush of adrenaline coursing through my veins. It wasn't the jittery thrill of anxiety, but the cold euphoria of a 5-star general sitting in a command bunker, watching her elite troops advance to retake a hijacked fortress. The clock on the wall struck exactly 10 a.m. On the screen, a massive black SUV abruptly pulled up to the curb right in front of the main entrance of the restaurant. The heavy doors swung open. Robert stepped out. He wore an immaculate, razor-sharp gray suit, his silver hair slicked back, carrying a thick leather binder tucked firmly under his arm. Right behind him stepped 4 massive, intimidating men wearing professional, all-black private security uniforms, with walkie-talkies clipped to their belts. These weren't street thugs. They were the pure embodiment of absolute order and corporate discipline. I watched Robert give a swift hand signal. A locksmith, who had arrived with them, immediately walked up to the main double doors. The screech of a heavy power drill buzzed, and even though I couldn't hear the audio clearly through the outdoor camera, I could perfectly imagine how sweet it sounded. The old lock, the one Eric held the master key to, was violently drilled out and dropped to the pavement with a satisfying clatter. In its place, a brand-new, high-security lock was installed. In less than 15 minutes, the physical control of the heritage was securely back in my hands. The heavy doors swung open, and Robert led his tactical team inside. Switching to the kitchen camera feed, I watched the atmosphere instantly grow incredibly tense. The prep cooks and sous chefs were chopping vegetables with zero enthusiasm, their faces pale, marked by heavy exhaustion and anxiety. They hadn't been paid in weeks, and worse, they had entirely lost faith in the place they loved. When they looked up and saw Robert marching in, flanked by 4 massive security guards, their first reaction was sheer panic. They thought these were the aggressive debt collectors coming to seize the equipment. But then, Robert raised his hand high to calm the room. He snapped open the leather binder and pulled out the termination notice bearing my signature and the bright red legal seal. He read something aloud. I couldn't make out the exact words through the camera's muted mic, but I watched the miraculous, instant transformation on the faces of my old crew. Maria, the veteran sous chef, literally dropped the heavy onion she was holding. She covered her mouth with both hands, and her shoulders began to shake with sobs. The young dishwasher actually jumped straight into the air, pumping his fists wildly. They swarmed Robert. Massive, genuine smiles returned to their exhausted faces. It was the purest smile of liberation. They knew immediately. Helen was back, and justice was going to be served cold. They dispersed instantly, following Robert's strict new orders to the letter. One sprinted to do a massive inventory check in the walk-in freezer. Another helped the IT tech rapidly change all the master passwords on the point-of-sale systems. Everything moved with the ruthless efficiency of a newly oiled machine. 11 a.m. Eric's incredibly flashy red sports car whipped around the corner and slammed on the brakes right in front of the restaurant. My son stepped out of the car, looking incredibly smug and carefree, still wearing his expensive designer sunglasses, casually sipping from an iced Starbucks cup. Arriving to work at this hour, when the kitchen should have been firing on all cylinders for hours already, I held my breath and leaned closer to the screen. Eric whistled a tune as he strolled up to the heavy glass doors. He reached into his tailored slacks, pulled out his expensive keychain, and jammed the key into the lock. He tried to turn it. It wouldn't budge. He frowned, pulled the key out, blew on it, and shoved it back in. He twisted it aggressively, still jammed solid. Deep annoyance began to spread across his face. He slammed his fist against the glass, then whipped out his electronic manager's keycard from his leather wallet and violently swiped it across the wall reader to pop the automatic doors. The reader flashed a solid, bright red light. Access denied. He swiped it a second time. Red again. Total bewilderment began to replace his initial arrogant swagger. He started pounding on the glass doors with both fists, screaming something. Right at that moment, the door smoothly opened from the inside. But the person who opened it wasn't a terrified waiter bowing to greet him like every other day. It was the lead of the security team, a man built like a brick wall, towering over Eric, entirely blocking the entrance. Eric tried to angrily muscle his way past him, but the guard easily stopped him with one solid, immovable arm across the chest. Watching his frantic gestures, I could perfectly read the dialogue. My son was screaming, "Get out of my way! I am the boss here. Who the hell are you?" The guard stood as still as a stone statue, his face utterly blank, and simply pointed a thick finger back toward the street. Robert casually stepped out of the lobby, crossed his arms over his chest, and looked at Eric through the glass with a terrifyingly calm, dead-eyed expression as if he were staring at a raving lunatic who had stumbled into the wrong building. He didn't open the door. He didn't step outside to argue. He simply raised a heavy printed sign that read, "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone." Eric stood completely frozen in shock. He stumbled back several steps, nearly tripping over his own expensive shoes on the curb. His face turned beet red, partly from the blazing sun, but mostly from the blinding rage and utter humiliation of noticing several pedestrians stopping to point and stare at the commotion. Powerless and panicking, he whipped out his cell phone and furiously dialed my number. On my mahogany desk, my phone instantly began vibrating violently. The screen lit up with the name, Eric, beloved son. I stared down at it. The ringing echoed loudly in the dead silent room, sounding so incredibly shrill, desperate, and pathetic. On the iPad screen, I watched Eric pacing wildly back and forth on the sidewalk, phone pressed hard against his ear, his face a perfect mask of pleading terror and panic. I reached my hand out, but not to answer. My thumb clamped down on the power button on the side of the device. The phone's screen instantly went black. The room plunged back into absolute, flawless silence. On the security feed, I watched Eric slowly let his arm drop, staring down at his useless phone with an expression of absolute, soul-crushing defeat. He understood. He finally understood that the massive umbrella that had shielded him from reality for his entire life had just snapped shut. The heavy doors of the Heritage slammed shut right in his face, just as freezing cold and immovable as my own heart. In that moment, my total silence was the most deafening, violent answer I could possibly give. The chessboard had been flipped, and the queen was back on her throne. Have you ever in your life chosen to turn off your phone and remain entirely silent to deliver a crushing, decisive blow and reclaim your own justice? The feeling of violently taking back the steering wheel of your own destiny is truly indescribable. Tell me about your most empowering, ruthless moment in the comments. At 12 noon, the sun was at its absolute peak over Chicago, baking the asphalt with punishing heat. I was still sitting frozen in my home office, my eyes permanently glued to the iPad screen. My old heart was hammering against my ribs, a wild mix of tension and giddy anticipation for the grand finale that was about to unfold. Exactly as I had predicted, the family's luxury Mercedes SUV, the vehicle I had bought with the profits of selling food on the streets for years, pulled up aggressively to the valet stand at the Heritage. The door flew open. Chloe stepped out. I let out a harsh, bitter laugh, mixed with pure disgust. She still didn't know a damn thing. It seemed that Eric's pathetic cowardice had reached an entirely new, historical low. My spineless son, after being publicly blocked and having all his funds completely severed, hadn't even dared to call his wife to deliver the apocalyptic news. He was too terrified of Chloe's wrath, too terrified of her screaming at him. So, he chose to run and hide, letting his arrogant wife waltz directly into the steel trap that had just been set for her. What an utterly pathetic excuse for a man. Today, Chloe was wearing a glaringly bright red silk dress with a slit dangerously high up her thigh, a vulgar, screaming display of wealth. She was accompanied by 3 other heavily made-up women, all laughing loudly as if the upscale restaurant were their own personal backyard. They strutted into the lobby, chins pointed at the ceiling, the sharp clicking of their stiletto heels echoing off the marble floors with a shrill, obnoxious arrogance. The veteran staff, freshly briefed by Robert, gave her proper, polite nods, but their eyes no longer held even an ounce of the paralyzing fear from yesterday. They guided Chloe's pack straight to the largest, most visible round VIP table by the indoor fountain, the exact same spot she had ruthlessly thrown me out of just 24 hours earlier. Through the audio feed on the camera, I could clearly hear my daughter-in-law's shrill, grating voice ringing out. "Lunch is on me today, girls. Order absolutely whatever you want. It's my family's restaurant. We own this place. Eat and drink until you drop. Waiter, bring the premium menus, and make it snappy." She aggressively snapped her fingers in the air, treating the veteran staff like stray dogs. The feast commenced. The kitchen sent out the most outrageously expensive items on the menu. Lobster mac and cheese, dry-aged steaks on hot stones, and of course, they had to pop several bottles of outrageously priced French wine. The 4 women ate like starving wolves, laughing, joking, and throwing condescending, snobby glares at the other paying customers around them. Every now and then, I watched Chloe raise her crystal wine glass high, the ruby liquid sparkling under the chandeliers, and boast loudly, "That decrepit old hag yesterday? I kicked her out on the street. Now, the Heritage is entirely in my hands. I am the absolute queen here." I gripped the armrests of my leather chair tightly, but I no longer felt angry. I only felt immense pity. "Enjoy it, sweetheart, because that is the absolute last glass of wine you will ever drink in this building." 2 hours passed. The massive table was a chaotic disaster zone of cracked lobster shells and empty wine bottles. Chloe waved her hand dismissively to demand the check. She reached into her designer purse and whipped out the almighty black corporate credit card, the exact same supplementary card I had blindly paid off every month to fund her vices and spoiled tantrums for years. She tossed the black card onto the leather check presenter with an air of absolute superiority, not even bothering to glance at the total. The waiter smoothly picked up the card and swiped it through the handheld terminal. A bright red error light flashed instantly. The waiter, perfectly following the exact script Robert had drilled into him, spoke with sickeningly sweet politeness. "I am so sorry, ma'am. The machine says there is a hard error with your card." Chloe severely scrunched up her face, clicking her tongue in loud annoyance. "Error? What the hell are you talking about? Your machine is a piece of garbage. Swipe it again. My card has no limit." The waiter tried it a second time, the exact same irritating beep and the same unforgiving glaring red light. The loud, obnoxious atmosphere around the table suddenly dropped dead. Chloe's three friends started exchanging highly uncomfortable glances, and hushed whispers broke out. Chloe's face turned the color of a ripe tomato. She slammed her palm flat against the table. "What kind of pathetic service is this? Call the general manager out here right this second." Right on cue, Robert stepped out of the back office. He calmly adjusted his silk tie and marched toward the table with heavy, dignified steps. In his hand, he held a ridiculously long, itemized receipt. He walked straight up to Chloe's table, locking eyes with her with a gaze made of pure granite. "I am right here." Chloe glared at him, her eyes wide with fury. "And who the hell are you? Where is Eric? Why don't I see my husband?" Robert didn't even dignify her question with an answer. He slapped the incredibly long receipt face up onto the table and spoke in a booming, authoritative voice that violently echoed across the now silent dining room. "Ma'am, this credit card has been permanently blocked and deactivated at the direct request of the primary account holder. The grand total for your lunch today is $850. Please pay your bill in cash immediately." Chloe sprang up from her chair like she had been electrocuted. The heavy wooden chair tipped backward and crashed loudly to the floor. She screamed, her voice cracking from a violent cocktail of rage and sudden, blinding panic. "Who do you think you are? Where is my husband? I am the owner of this place. You dare try to charge the owner. I will have you fired this exact second." Robert didn't flinch a single millimeter. He stood tall, straight, and utterly immovable, like a massive mountain blocking the furious hurricane of this arrogant woman. He raised his voice even louder, dropping every single word like a sledgehammer so that every customer and staff member in the building could hear him clearly. "Ma'am, there is only one owner of this establishment, and her name is Helen. You are not on the corporate payroll. You hold absolutely zero shares in this company. You are nothing but a customer. If you do not pay your bill this instant, I will be forced to call the Chicago Police Department and have you arrested for attempted theft of services." "What?" Chloe gasped, her jaw dropping open, all the blood draining from her face until she looked like a ghost. That old hag, she wouldn't dare. Furious whispers erupted from every corner of the room. The glares of disgust, mockery, and pure schadenfreude from the surrounding tables pierced into her like thousands of hot needles. Her three loyal friends scrambled to their feet, snatched their designer purses, and sprinted for the exit as fast as they could, as if terrified of catching a plague, leaving Chloe standing completely alone in the middle of the chaotic, messy table. I don't carry that kind of cash." Chloe stammered, her towering arrogance instantly shattered into a million pieces, leaving behind nothing but naked, humiliating panic. She frantically dug through her designer bag, but only pulled out a few loose quarters and a half-used tube of lipstick. Robert gave a sharp nod. Two massive security guards stepped up immediately. They weren't overly brutal, but they were more than firm enough as they clamped their hands onto both of her arms, locking her in place. "Please exit the premises immediately. We will mail the invoice to your parents' address." "Let go of me! What are you doing? Eric, where are you?" Chloe shrieked, thrashing and kicking wildly in vain, but nobody answered her. She was forcefully marched straight down the main aisle under the staring, mocking eyes of dozens of people. She was dragged over the exact same spot where I had walked away in complete humiliation just the day before. But today, she was the one bowing her head. Her elaborately styled hair was a chaotic, tangled mess. Her perfectly applied makeup was now smeared with ugly streaks of black mascara and terrified tears. The heavy glass doors of the restaurant swung open and slammed shut violently behind her. On my screen, I watched the staff and the paying customers actually begin to clap. The applause sounded like a massive, refreshing summer rainstorm, washing away every last speck of filth that Chloe had brought into my sanctuary. I leaned back heavily in my leather chair, letting out a massive, drawn-out sigh of absolute relief. A warm, glowing sensation of pure satisfaction spread rapidly through my chest. The brutal collapse of that massive, fake ego was pathetic to watch, but so incredibly well-deserved. I knew this was only the very beginning of her punishment, but at the very least, I knew I was going to eat a wonderful dinner tonight. Night descended over the Chicago suburbs, thick and silent. The muggy air practically screamed that a massive thunderstorm was about to break. But I knew perfectly well that the real storm wasn't coming from the sky above. It was currently hurtling toward my wrought iron driveway gate inside a luxury Mercedes that I had paid for. 6 p.m. I was sitting in the patio chair on my second-floor balcony, my hands calmly folded in my lap. I didn't turn on a single light in the house. The pitch-black darkness was the absolute perfect shield at this moment. Suddenly, I heard the furious roar of an engine tearing down the quiet street, followed by the violent screeching of heavy tires slamming on the brakes right in front of my gate. Then, the explosive slam of a heavy car door, and the frantic, aggressive clacking of high heels sprinting across the asphalt. "Open the damn gate! What the hell do you think you're doing? Open this gate right now!" Chloe's shrieking voice violently ripped through the quiet suburban night, shrill and overflowing with toxic insolence. There was no trace of respect left. She was frantically rattling and banging her fists against the heavy, solid iron gate, the loud clanging of the metal echoing down the entire block. "Mom! Mom! Are you in there? Come out here and explain this right now. Why did you block all of our cards? Why did your people physically throw my wife out?" Eric had also started screaming, his voice shaking uncontrollably, a pathetic cocktail of blazing anger and paralyzing terror. I remained seated, taking a long, deep breath of the freezing night wind. Years ago, hearing even a slight cough from my son would have made me jump up in a panic. But tonight, his screaming only turned my heart into harder steel. I had been heavily bracing myself for this exact moment since the second I walked out of the lawyer's office. I stood up, pulled my shawl tightly over my shoulders, and walked slowly to the edge of the balcony railing. Down below, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the street lamp, I watched two figures thrashing around like cornered, desperate animals. Chloe's hair was a wild rat's nest, the expensive red silk dress from the afternoon now wrinkled and pathetic. Eric, for his part, was pacing in frantic circles, uselessly punching the brick pillars holding up the gate. "Stop banging on the gate," I said. My voice deadly calm, but absolutely freezing, echoed down from the darkness above them. "That gate is solid wrought iron. Your soft hands won't dent it. You'll only shatter your own bones." Hearing my voice, they both violently snapped their heads upward. "You old witch, get down here right now!" Chloe pointed a shaking finger up at me, her face grotesquely contorted by fury. "Who the hell do you think you are, humiliating me in front of my friends? Call the bank right now and reactivate my card. If you don't, I swear to God I will sue you for embezzlement." I actually laughed softly. She wanted to sue me for taking back my own money? Her stupidity truly knew absolutely no bounds. "Look at the brick pillar to your right," I ordered coldly, completely ignoring her empty, pathetic threat. "There is a thick white envelope taped to it. Grab it and read it yourself." Eric looked utterly bewildered, snapping his head in the direction I pointed. He spotted the large, heavy envelope securely taped to the cold brick. He ripped it down, his hands visibly shaking. The dim light of the street lamp was just barely bright enough for him to read the bold, black ink printed on the crisp white paper. I watched every single microscopic shift in my son's face. First, a deep frown of heavy confusion. Then, his eyes blew wide open in sheer, unadulterated horror. Finally, his hands went completely limp, dropping the heavy stack of legal papers, letting them scatter violently across the dirty pavement. "Mom, is this real?" Eric stared up at me, his voice totally broken, sounding like a suffocating sob. "Read it out loud so your wife can hear it," I commanded. Eric physically couldn't speak, so Chloe aggressively snatched the scattered papers off the concrete. She squinted at them under the yellow light, her eyes darting frantically across the legal jargon. Notice of termination? Asset seizure and recovery? Chloe stammered out, her voice rapidly shrinking until it completely disappeared. Inside that thick envelope were 3 devastating, legally binding documents with immediate effect, meticulously drafted by Attorney Mitchell that afternoon. First, the immediate termination of Eric from his position as general manager of the Heritage for gross financial misconduct. 0 severance pay, 0 unemployment benefits. Second, a 24-hour notice of eviction to immediately vacate the luxury, multi-million-dollar condo in Lincoln Park where they lived like absolute royalty. The property was in my name. I had only been letting them borrow it. Third, a repossession order for the flashy red sports car and the luxury Mercedes SUV they were currently driving. They were legally registered as corporate company vehicles, and neither of them were employees of the company anymore. "No, this can't be real," Chloe shrieked, violently crushing the papers in her fists. "You can't do this to us. No, where are we supposed to live? How are we supposed to drive anywhere? Are you trying to kill your own son?" "I am not killing anyone," I replied, my voice as hard and heavy as a sledgehammer striking an anvil. "I am simply taking back what belongs to me. The things you took for granted and flushed down the drain." "Mom!" Eric collapsed onto his knees on the hard pavement, grabbing his head with both hands. "I am your son. I am your flesh and blood. Mom, how can you throw me out onto the street? Do you want me to starve to death?" Seeing my fully grown, adult son kneeling on the concrete, begging not out of genuine remorse, but out of absolute terror of losing his free ride, nearly shattered my heart into a million pieces. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that if I caved in now, I would destroy him for the rest of his life. It was time to aggressively cut this rotten umbilical cord once and for all. I leaned heavily against the freezing iron railing, staring dead into the eyes of both my children, and spoke every word with razor-sharp clarity, letting them echo into the silent night. "I gave you absolutely everything. A massive, beautiful home, luxury cars, an incredibly easy, high-paying job, and the shining reputation of a respected, hard-working family. But what did you trade it for? For shallow vanity, utter laziness, and despicable, sickening ingratitude. You used my hard-earned money to fund a pack of parasites. You used my flawless reputation to show off to strangers. And you used my boundless love as a doormat to trample on my dignity." I paused, swallowing the heavy lump forming in my throat, my gaze more fierce and determined than ever before. "The beautiful sandcastle you built using my money has officially collapsed. From this exact second forward, you have to fend for yourselves. No more black credit cards, no more free luxury condos, no more cleaning staff to wipe up the messes you make. Get out there. Find a real job, wash dishes, wipe down tables, learn exactly how heavy a single dollar truly weighs." "You are evil. You are an absolute monster," Chloe screamed in pure desperation, violently hurling one of her expensive stiletto heels over the gate, where it smashed against the driveway with a loud crack. I didn't even flinch. I looked down at Eric, my son, who was still slumped on his knees on the concrete, his shadow stretching long and pathetically weak under the street lamp. When you finally learn the true value of money earned with your own 2 bare hands, when you finally learn how to apologize with genuine sincerity, then, and only then, you can come back and speak to me. For now, get the hell off my property. The repo team is coming to tow those cars in exactly 15 minutes. With that, I turned on my heel and walked back inside the house. Mom, please don't leave me." Eric sobbed hysterically behind me. "Stop! Don't you dare walk away!" Chloe shrieked frantically. I violently yanked the heavy blackout curtains shut, completely blocking out the light and the desperate screaming from outside. The room plunged back into its usual, deafening silence. I leaned heavily against the wall. Suddenly, my legs felt like jelly, and I slid down the wall until I hit the cold hardwood floor. I didn't cry. My tears had completely dried up the night before. Now, there was only a massive, hollow void inside me. But it was a strictly necessary void, one required to start entirely over. I had violently smashed the protective cocoon surrounding my children. They were going to feel immense pain. They were going to bleed. But it was the only possible way they would ever have a chance to grow into butterflies and learn to fly with their own wings. Outside, the faint wailing of a police siren began to echo in the distance. I knew it was time for the curtain to permanently fall on this tragic play of toxic dependency. This was going to be an incredibly long, agonizing night for them. And for me, too. 3 full months have passed since that explosive night. Time in Chicago seems to fly by much faster when you are busy and genuinely happy. The brutal winter thaw has ended, making way for a brilliant, deep blue spring sky and golden sunlight filtering through the blooming lilac bushes. I am sitting at my usual table, tucked away in a quiet corner of the indoor garden at the Heritage, slowly sipping a hot cup of herbal tea. The atmosphere around me is no longer a chaotic nightmare of unpaid debts and crushing anxiety. It is a vibrant, enthusiastic rhythm of a perfectly run machine. Robert, wearing his impeccably tailored gray suit, glides smoothly between the tables, always offering a warm, polite smile to the regulars. He is doing a phenomenal job, even better than I had hoped. The restaurant's revenue over the last 3 months hasn't just skyrocketed to cover the previous massive losses. It has generated an incredibly healthy profit margin. I look down at the open folder sitting on my table. It isn't a stack of overdue invoices. It is the finalized list of the very first kids who will receive the Seeds of Tomorrow scholarship. I used a large chunk of my new profits to establish this foundation, which fully covers the college tuition for the children of my hardworking restaurant staff. Seeing the radiant, tearful look on sous chef Maria's face when she was handed the full-ride scholarship letter for her daughter, it made me realize something profound. True happiness in your old age isn't measured by how much money is sitting in your bank account. It's measured by how many genuine smiles that money can create. I have finally found absolute peace. In the afternoons, instead of locking myself in a dark office to desperately audit financial ledgers, I volunteer. I joined a charity group with some old friends. We cook massive pots of hearty stew for the homeless shelters downtown, and we knit warm sweaters for kids in the poorer neighborhoods. My heart feels incredibly light, as if a massive boulder has been lifted off my chest. But, deep down in the heart of any mother, there is always a tiny, hidden corner that constantly worries, constantly looking out toward the gritty neighborhoods on the south side of the city. I haven't actively contacted Eric or Chloe once. I have kept my ironclad promise, but the eyes and ears of someone who has lived her entire life in this city have kept me thoroughly informed. The veteran suppliers at the wholesale markets whisper to me that after I ruthlessly cut off all their funds and seized their luxury assets, they went through absolute hell. They screamed, they fought, they cried. Chloe even tried to run back to her mother's house, but was flat out rejected. Her parents absolutely refused to financially support a spoiled daughter, accustomed to luxury living but bringing in zero income. Finally, backed entirely into a corner with absolutely zero options, they were forced to rent a miserable, cramped, matchbox-sized apartment in a loud, gritty working-class neighborhood on the south side. To literally survive and put food on the table, Eric had to beg for a job as a lowly dishwasher at a rundown, greasy spoon diner called the Hopewell Diner. Chloe, after being forced to sell off every single one of her designer handbags just to make rent, was forced to swallow her pride and take a job as a waitress at the exact same diner. Today, this very afternoon, I decided to finally break my own rule and visit that neighborhood. I didn't take my usual luxury town car. I hailed an old, beat-up taxi so I wouldn't draw any attention. The cab pulled to a stop across the street from the Hopewell Diner. It was a tiny, cramped diner, thick with greasy smoke and deafeningly loud, an entirely different universe from the opulent splendor of the Heritage. I pulled the brim of my sun hat down low, watching silently through the grease-stained front window. In the fully exposed, cramped kitchen area, I saw Eric, my son. He was no longer wearing expensive, tailored suits, and his hair wasn't slicked back with expensive gel. He was wearing a faded, stained gray t-shirt, a heavy rubber apron tied tight around his waist, and thick sweat was actively pouring down his forehead. He stood hunched over a massive, industrial stainless steel sink, furiously scrubbing one filthy, grease-caked plate after another at breakneck speed. At one point, I watched him stop, wipe the heavy sweat from his brow with the back of his arm, and stretch out his aching back. But the most incredible thing was, in his eyes, there was absolutely no trace of the lazy apathy, the pathetic cowardice, or the evasiveness from before. His gaze was intensely focused, shining with a raw, desperate determination that I hadn't seen in him since he was a little boy. He was surviving on his own pure grit. Then, I looked toward a cramped corner of the diner's dining room. Chloe was taking a brief break after the brutal lunch rush. My daughter-in-law, who used to look down her nose at everyone, was now wearing cheap, worn-out canvas sneakers. She was slouched in a booth, actively massaging her swollen, aching feet after standing and serving tables for 6 straight hours. Her fingernails, which used to be perfectly long and manicured, were chopped short, and her hands were clearly beginning to look rough and calloused. Eric finished scrubbing the last stack of plates, aggressively wiped his wet hands on his apron, and walked over to his wife. He handed her a tall plastic cup of ice water. I held my breath, terrified that they were about to start screaming at each other, terrified that Chloe was going to throw the water in his face and berate him. But no. Chloe took the cup with both hands and chugged the water down. She looked up at her husband with an incredibly exhausted gaze, but there was zero resentment in her eyes. I watched her lips move. Even though I was across the street, thanks to my years of reading customers' lips in loud dining rooms, I could guess exactly what she was saying. "What are we doing for dinner tonight, honey? I'm really craving a grilled cheese." Eric smiled. It was a gentle, deeply genuine smile, looking exactly like his late father. He slid into the booth next to her, gently massaging her tired shoulders, and replied, "Sure, I'll make it. Hey, did you text Mom today?" My heart did a massive flip. Hot, stinging tears instantly sprang to my eyes and rolled freely down my wrinkled cheeks. Chloe slowly shook her head, her posture slumping sadly. "I don't dare. I'm so terrified she's still furious with us. When we save up enough tip money to buy her a really nice gift, I'll write to her." I turned around, not daring to watch for another second. I was terrified that if I stayed, I wouldn't be able to stop myself from sprinting across the street and pulling them both into a massive hug. But I knew, deep in my bones, that it wasn't the right time yet. They were currently learning the single most vital, brutal lesson of their entire lives, and I had absolutely no right to interrupt that sacred process. All true growth requires immense pain and time. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small white envelope. Inside, there wasn't a massive fortune, just enough cash to buy a really good hot meal, or maybe a brand new, comfortable pair of work shoes. This wasn't charity. It was a silent, anonymous push of encouragement. I quickly slipped inside the diner while Eric and Chloe were entirely out of sight in the back storeroom. I dropped the envelope quietly onto the checkout counter and whispered to the old diner owner standing by the register, "Sir, please give this to your 2 newest employees. Tell them it's a gift from an old customer for their excellent service." Then, I turned on my heel and walked rapidly out of the diner, blending completely into the bustling afternoon crowds. The late afternoon sun projected my long shadow across the concrete sidewalk, but my footsteps had absolutely never felt this incredibly light. I knew that my children, those fragile, weak little saplings, had finally, truly begun to sink deep roots into the hard earth and grow upward toward the sun. Walking down the tree-lined street toward the taxi stand, I deeply reflected on the violent, tempestuous journey I had just survived. The story of my family, of the heritage, is likely the exact same story shared by countless other families across the country. We mothers often have a deeply ingrained, toxic habit of sacrificing absolutely everything for our children. We foolishly believe that true love means giving unconditionally, shielding them from every single drop of rain. But my friends, true love sometimes demands the brutal cruelty of logic. Protecting ourselves and enforcing our own ironclad boundaries is not selfishness. It is the absolute only way to truly earn the respect of our children. If we continue playing the role of a soulless ATM, an exhausted, unpaid servant, our children will simply take it for granted as our required duty. Always remember, only a truly happy, fiercely independent mother can raise truly happy, fiercely independent children. Do not ever let your boundless kindness mutate into the very poison that destroys your children's ability to survive in the real world. And to the children out there, those of you caught in the crossfire between your family of origin and your new marriage, I pray you understand that balance is the ultimate key to a happy life. Your spouse is the person who will walk beside you until the end of your days, absolutely. But your parents are your deep roots. They are the soil where you began. Never, ever, in the name of romantic love, trample on the blood and sacrifice of the people who gave you life. A partner who genuinely loves you will fiercely respect the people who brought you into this world. They will never attempt to isolate you or exploit them. If that scale tips, the very foundation of your own new family will inevitably crumble into dust. And the single most expensive, agonizing lesson my family had to learn was about the blinding nature of greed. Greed and extreme selfishness are a highly corrosive acid that destroys the most sacred bonds. When money becomes the ultimate, obsessive goal, people are more than willing to put on fake masks, calling themselves family while hiding a butcher knife behind their backs. Money can always be earned back. A bankrupt restaurant can always be rebuilt. But once familial love is violently shattered over material greed, the ugly scar remains forever. Do not let material wealth blind you so completely that, when you finally look back, you find yourself entirely alone inside a freezing cold castle made of gold. Finally, for those of you who are currently in, or about to enter, a serious relationship, build it entirely on a foundation of shared struggle and honest, hard work. Lasting, unbreakable love does not blossom at lavish parties paid for with someone else's credit card. It elevates and solidifies when two people are scrubbing greasy dishes side by side, massaging each other's swollen feet after a brutal day of work, and planning tomorrow's humble dinner with a peaceful, deeply genuine smile. That is the most priceless, beautiful legacy we could ever possibly leave behind in this life. The story you have just heard has had its names and locations altered to protect the identities of those involved. Now, I really want to hear your raw opinion. What do you think about the ruthless decision Helen made? If you were standing in her shoes, would you have done anything differently? Tell me exactly what you think in the comments down below. I genuinely read every single one, and your voice truly matters here. If this story struck a chord and made you reflect, please don't forget to leave a like, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on our upcoming stories. I will see you all in the next tale. Thank you. We are before the silence, using the power of stories to walk beside you through time and help you rediscover the peace and iron strength of your soul.